The baggage carousel hummed in slow rotation, suitcases tumbling past tired travelers, and 8-year-old Ivy Thornton stood on her tiptoes near the arrivals gate, her pink rolling suitcase beside her, scanning the crowd for a face she'd been dreaming about for 2 weeks. She wasn't looking for her aunt. She was looking for him, Officer Callum Reed, and more importantly, Flint, the beautiful black and tan German shepherd who'd sat perfectly still during the school assembly, who'd found the hidden tennis ball in under 10 seconds, who'd looked at her with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand everything. Ivy had promised she'd wave next time she saw him at the airport, and now, clutching the handle of her suitcase, her heart hammered with the kind of excitement only a child feels when something magical is about to happen. She spotted the uniform first, the dark navy vest with the fluorescent stripes, then the dog at heel position, and her face lit up like sunlight breaking through clouds. But what happened next, what Flint did in the span of 3 heartbeats, would unravel a scheme that had been carefully constructed to use her innocence as a weapon, and it would force Officer Reed to confront a nightmare he'd seen too many times before. A child caught in the crossfire of adult evil. A little girl with no idea that the suitcase she'd been told to carry, the one Derek had packed so carefully and zipped shut with a smile, was supposed to make her a criminal before she even understood what the word meant. Reed was 70 feet away, scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of a handler who'd worked airport interdiction for 6 years, when Flint's body language shifted. The dog's head snapped toward the arrivals area, ears forward, nostrils flaring, and then he pulled. Hard. Reed's grip tightened on the lead, his pulse spiking instantly, because Flint didn't pull unless he had scent. Strong scent, the kind that meant narcotics were close, concentrated, and moving. Reed's eyes followed the invisible line of Flint's focus, cutting through the sea of passengers, and landed on a little girl in a purple jacket waving at him with both hands, a wide smile on her face, a pink suitcase standing beside her like a birthday present. Reed's stomach dropped. He knew that face. He knew that smile. He'd seen it 2 weeks ago in a gymnasium full of second graders, when she'd raised her hand and asked if Flint ever got scared, and he'd knelt down to let her touch the dog's fur while explaining that good dogs protect people even when they're afraid. Her name was Ivy. She'd told him she was going to visit her aunt soon and promised to wave if she saw him, and now she was waving, and Flint was alerting on her luggage with the kind of intensity that made Reed's hands go cold. Flint lunged forward, dragging Reed 3 steps before he could brace, and the dog went straight to the pink suitcase, nose jamming against the seam of the zipper, body rigid, tail high and still. The trained final alert. Positive indication. Reed's mind raced through every possibility, every innocent explanation, but his training overrode hope. He keyed his radio with shaking fingers, his voice low and controlled. Control, this is K97. I have a positive alert on a juvenile's luggage at arrivals gate C3. Need immediate backup and supervisor response. Ivy's smile faltered. She looked down at Flint, confused, then back up at Reed with the beginning of fear creeping into her bright eyes. Officer Reed? Her voice was small, uncertain, and it cracked something inside his chest. He forced his face into a calm mask, the kind he used when he didn't want a suspect to see his hand. But this wasn't a suspect. This was a child who'd waved at him like he was a hero. Within 90 seconds, 3 more K9 teams converged on the spot. Officer Aisha Patel with her Belgian Malinois, Rook. Officer Tobias Grant with his Dutch Shepherd, Juno. Officer Lena Osakwe with her Labrador, Bree. Reed hadn't called them individually. They'd heard his tone and responded like blood in the water. 4 dogs, 4 handlers, and all 4 animals locked onto the same target. Rook sat hard beside the suitcase. Juno pawed twice at the base. Bree whined and pressed her nose against the handle. Every single trained narcotics detection dog in the terminal had just confirmed what Flint found first. The crowd began to pull back, parents tugging children away from the sudden cluster of police presence, and Ivy stood frozen in the center of it all, her small hands clenched together, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't do anything wrong. Her voice broke on the last word, and Reed's heart twisted violently. He crouched down to her level, his face even with hers, his voice gentle in a way that took every ounce of control he had left. "Ivy, sweetheart, I know you didn't, but I need to ask you something very important, okay?" He kept his body language open, non-threatening, even as Patel moved to secure the perimeter and Grant radioed for a supervisor and customs enforcement. Ivy nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks now, her breath hitching. Reed's throat tightened. "Who packed this suitcase for you?" Ivy's lips trembled. She glanced toward the exit doors, then back at Reed, and something in her expression told him she'd been warned, coached, threatened maybe. "Derek did," she whispered. "My mom's boyfriend. He said it was easier because I didn't know how to fold things right. He said I'd get in trouble if I messed it up." Reed felt the rage boil up behind his ribs, but he kept his face soft, kept his tone steady. "And where's Derek now, Ivy?" He dropped me off at the curb. He said he had to park the car and he'd meet Aunt Claire here to pick me up." Her voice wavered, small and lost. "He told me not to let anyone touch my suitcase. He said if I told anyone he packed it, I'd ruin the surprise for Aunt Claire." Reed exchanged a glance with Patel, whose jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. Every handler in that circle knew exactly what they were looking at. A mule. A child mule. Coerced, manipulated, used as a clean face to move product through a secure facility, because no one suspects a little girl with a pink suitcase and a stuffed rabbit clipped to the handle. Osakwe was already on her radio, voice clipped and urgent. "We need eyes on all exits. White male, mid-30s, named Derek. Last seen drop-off lane. Consider him a flight risk and potential trafficker." Ivy's sobs came harder now, her small body shaking, and Reed did something that protocol didn't quite allow, but his heart demanded. He reached out and rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Ivy, listen to me. You are not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Do you understand me? You are safe now. Flint found something bad that someone else put in your suitcase, and now we're going to make sure that person can't hurt you or anyone else." Flint, still seated beside the luggage, turned his head toward Ivy and let out a soft huff, as if echoing Reed's promise. The little girl looked down at the dog, her tears catching the fluorescent lights, and reached out one trembling hand to touch his head. Flint leaned into her palm, warm and steady, and for just a moment the chaos around them seemed to pause. But the suitcase still sat there between them, silent, pink, and poisonous, and somewhere in the terminal, Derek was running. Grant was already suited up in full tactical gloves, evidence kits spread open on the stainless steel table that airport security had wheeled out from their back office. The suitcase sat in the center of the cordoned area now, pink fabric almost obscene under the harsh white LEDs they'd set up to document the search. Ivy had been moved 20 feet back, seated on a bench between two female officers from the airport's family liaison unit, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, even though the terminal wasn't cold. Reed could see her watching, her eyes red and swollen, her fingers twisted together in her lap. He wanted to shield her from what came next, but she needed to see it, needed to understand that none of this was her fault, that the evil had been hidden from her just as deliberately as it had been hidden inside the luggage. Grant unzipped the main compartment slowly, methodically, narrating every action for the body cam footage that would be dissected in court months from now. Main zipper released. No resistance. No secondary locks or tampering evident on exterior. His gloved hands lifted the top flap, and at first glance, it looked exactly like what an 8-year-old's weekend bag should look like. Folded shirts in pastel colors, a pair of jeans, pajamas with cartoon stars printed on them, a toothbrush in a clear plastic case. Innocent, normal, a lie wrapped in cotton and denim. Patel stood to Grant's left, her own camera recording from a second angle, and Osakwe had positioned herself between the search area and the small crowd of onlookers that security was struggling to keep at bay. Flint sat at Reed's side, still focused, still locked in on the scent, even though the source was about to be exposed. Reed's hand rested on the dog's shoulder, steadying himself as much as the animal, and his jaw ached from clenching his teeth too hard for too long. Grant removed the clothing layer by layer, placing each item into a separate evidence bag, and then his hands paused. His eyes flicked up to Reed, just for a second, and Reed saw the confirmation he'd been dreading. Grant's fingers pressed down gently on the base of the suitcase, testing, and the false bottom flexed under the pressure. There was a hollow space beneath the visible luggage floor, a space that shouldn't exist in a child's overnight bag. Grant pulled a flathead tool from his kit and carefully pried up the edge of the fabric-covered panel, peeling it back with the slow precision of someone diffusing a device that could ruin lives. Underneath, vacuum-sealed in thick plastic, were 6 rectangular packages, each one stamped with a small logo that Reed recognized from a dozen interdiction briefings. Fentanyl, high-grade synthetic opioid, compressed and packaged for distribution, worth more on the street than the average family earned in a year. Enough to kill a neighborhood if it hit the wrong hands, cut wrong. Sold to users who thought they were buying something softer, and it had been hidden 2 inches below a stuffed unicorn and a pair of socks with glitter threads. Grant's voice was flat, emotionless, but his hands shook just slightly as he photographed the packages in place. 6 vacuum-sealed parcels, consistent with narcotics packaging, located in concealed compartment beneath factory luggage lining. Estimated combined weight, approximately 3 kilograms. Reed heard a sharp intake of breath behind him and turned to see Ivy staring at the open suitcase, her face drained of color, her small body rigid with shock. One of the liaison officers leaned down and murmured something to her. But Ivy shook her head, her eyes wide and fixed on the bags that had been inches from her clothes, from her hands, from everything she'd touched without knowing. Reed's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. She'd carried it through the terminal. She'd smiled at strangers. She'd waved at him. And the whole time, Derek had been watching, waiting for her to deliver his poison, without ever understanding what she was carrying. Osakwe's radio crackled, a sharp burst of static, followed by a tense male voice. "We've got eyes on a possible suspect matching description. White male, mid-30s, gray jacket, moving fast toward short-term parking exit on level 2. No luggage, no visible companion." Osakwe keyed her mic instantly. "Hold position. Do not approach. We need tactical intercept. Suspect is linked to narcotics trafficking and child exploitation. Consider armed and desperate." Reed's pulse spiked. Derek was still here, still in the terminal, maybe watching from a distance, maybe waiting to see if Ivy made it through, maybe ready to bolt the second he realized the dogs had tagged her. Either way, he was running now, and running men made mistakes. Reed looked down at Flint, the dog's ears pricked forward, body still coiled with the energy of a working animal who hadn't been released yet. And Reed made a decision that protocol would question later, but instinct demanded now. He turned to Patel, his voice low and hard. "Stay with Ivy. Do not let her out of your sight. I don't care if her aunt shows up with a birth certificate and a lawyer. No one takes that child until we have Derek in custody and her mother is verified clean." Patel nodded once, her expression grim, and moved toward the bench where Ivy sat trembling under the blanket. Reed straightened, his hand tightening on Flint's lead, and he locked eyes with Osakwe. "Where's tactical response positioned?" "North checkpoint and main security hub. They're gearing up now, but it's a 3-minute sprint to level 2 parking." She paused, reading his face, and something shifted in her posture. "You're not waiting, are you?" Reed didn't answer. He just started moving, Flint surging forward beside him, and Osakwe cursed under her breath before falling into step 2 paces behind, her radio already barking orders to redirect the intercept team toward the parking structure. They cut through the terminal at a pace that made travelers scatter, Reed's boots pounding against polished tile, Flint's claws clicking in rapid rhythm, and the noise of the crowd faded into a distant hum behind the roar of adrenaline flooding his system. He wasn't thinking about procedure anymore. He was thinking about Ivy's face when she touched Flint's head. He was thinking about the vacuum-sealed bags hidden under her pajamas. He was thinking about how many other children Derek had used before her, and how many he'd use next if he slipped through their fingers. They hit the stairwell access at a full sprint, the heavy door slamming open, and Reed took the steps 3 at a time, Flint bounding beside him with the kind of focused intensity that only a working dog in pursuit mode could sustain. 2 floors up, then through the connector hallway that smelled like gasoline and exhaust, and finally out into the dim concrete cavern of short-term parking where the sound of engines idling and car alarms echoed off low ceilings. Osakwe's radio hissed again, the voice sharper now, urgent. Suspect located, row D, gray sedan. He's in the driver's seat, engine running. Reed's eyes scanned the rows, fluorescent lights casting long shadows between parked vehicles, and then he saw it. 40 yards ahead. A gray Honda with a man in the driver's seat, his head turned toward the rearview mirror, his face pale and slick with sweat even from this distance. Their eyes met across the expanse of concrete and painted lines, and Derek's expression shifted from panic to rage in the span of a single heartbeat. The engine roared, tires screamed against concrete, and the car lurched forward, straight toward the exit ramp, straight toward the chance to disappear into the city beyond the airport perimeter. But Reed was already moving, and Flint was faster. Reed's arm shot out, his voice a command that cut through the roar of the engine like a blade. Flint, block! The German Shepherd exploded forward, a black and tan blur of muscle and training, closing the distance between man and vehicle faster than Derek could process what was happening. Flint didn't go for the tires, didn't waste energy on metal and rubber that couldn't feel pain or fear. He went for the driver's side door, launching himself at the window with a bark that echoed like a gunshot off the concrete walls, his body slamming against the glass hard enough to make the entire car shudder. Derek flinched violently, his hands jerking on the wheel, and the sedan swerved left, clipping the side mirror of a parked SUV with a screech of torn metal. Reed was 10 yards behind, his lungs burning, his radio bouncing against his chest, and he saw the moment Derek's nerve broke. The car fishtailed, overcorrected, and then the brakes locked up with a tortured squeal as Derek realized he had 2 choices: run over a police dog on camera in front of a dozen witnesses, or stop. He stopped. Engine still running, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, his face a mask of trapped animal panic visible even through the tinted glass. Osakwe came up on Reed's right, weapon drawn. Driver, turn off the engine. Hands on the wheel where I can see them. Do it now. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. The engine idled. Flint circled the car, still barking, his focus absolute, and Reed's heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. Derek's eyes darted toward the rearview mirror, toward the side windows, calculating, weighing his odds, and Reed saw the exact moment the man considered ramming through anyway, dog or no dog, consequences be damned. Reed stepped directly into the car's path, his body between Derek and the exit ramp, and his voice was low, cold, and edged with something that made even Osakwe glance at him. You put 3 kilos of fentanyl in an 8-year-old suitcase. You used a child as a mule. You don't get to run. Derek's face twisted, rage and desperation bleeding together, and his hand moved toward the gear shift. But then, the sound of boots on concrete echoed from 3 directions at once, and the tactical response team finally arrived. 4 officers in full gear, rifles raised, voices overlapping in a wall of authority that left no room for negotiation. Exit the vehicle, hands visible, engine off now. The fight went out of Derek all at once, his shoulders sagging, his hands lifting slowly off the wheel to press against the roof of the car where the officers could see them. The engine died. The parking garage fell silent, except for Flint's panting and the crackle of radios coordinating the arrest. Reed's legs felt like water, adrenaline draining out of him so fast it left him dizzy, but he didn't move. He stood there, watching as 2 officers yanked Derek's door open, dragged him out onto the concrete, and cuffed him with the kind of efficiency that came from years of practice. Derek didn't fight, didn't speak. He just stared at Reed with eyes full of venom and defeat, and Reed stared back, without blinking, without flinching, until the officers hauled the man to his feet and started reading him his rights in flat mechanical tones. Trafficking, exploitation of a minor, possession with intent to distribute. The list went on, each charge another year added to a sentence that would likely outlive the man's relevance to anyone who'd ever known him. Osakwe holstered her weapon and let out a long, shaky breath, her hand dragging through her hair. "That was the dumbest, most reckless thing I've seen you do in 6 years, Reed." Reed looked down at Flint, who had returned to his side, tail wagging now, tongue lolling, the adrenaline of the chase already fading into the simple satisfaction of a job completed. Reed's hand dropped to the dog's head, fingers sinking into warm fur, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. He was going to get away. He was never going to get away. Osakwe's tone softened, just slightly, and she rested a hand on Reed's shoulder for a brief moment before stepping back. "Not with that dog on his scent. Not with what he did to that kid." She nodded toward the stairwell. "Come on, Ivy's still waiting. She needs to see that this is over." Reed nodded, his throat tight, and together they walked back through the parking structure, past the officers securing Derek into the back of a marked unit, past the tactical team already breaking down their perimeter, and back into the fluorescent-lit maze of the terminal, where the noise of normal life continued as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis for one little girl in a purple jacket. When they reached the arrivals area again, Reed saw Ivy immediately. She was still on the bench, still wrapped in the blanket, but Patel was crouched in front of her now, speaking softly, and standing beside them was a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and Ivy's same wide eyes. A woman whose face was streaked with tears and pale with shock. Ivy's mother. She must have been called the moment Derek's name came up in the system, must have driven to the airport not knowing whether her daughter was safe or in custody or worse. The moment Ivy saw Reed and Flint walking toward her, she stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders, and her face crumpled with relief so intense it looked like pain. "Officer Reed," her voice broke, and then she was moving, running the short distance between them, and Reed dropped to one knee just in time to catch her as she threw her arms around his neck and sobbed into his shoulder. He held her carefully, one arm around her small back, the other hand still gripping Flint's lead, and he felt her whole body shaking with the kind of tears that came from fear finally released. "You're okay, Ivy. You're safe. Derek's not going to hurt you or anyone else ever again." Flint pressed his nose against Ivy's leg, a soft whine escaping his throat, and she pulled back just enough to look down at the dog, her face wet and blotchy and impossibly young. "Flint knew," she whispered. "He knew something was wrong, didn't he?" Reed nodded, his own eyes burning. "He did. That's his job, to find the bad things people try to hide. And he found it because you were brave enough to tell us the truth." Ivy's mother stepped forward then, her hands trembling as she reached for her daughter, and Ivy turned and collapsed into her arms with a fresh wave of sobs. The woman looked at Reed over Ivy's head, her expression a mix of gratitude and devastation and rage that had no outlet left now that Derek was in custody. "I didn't know," she said, her voice hoarse. "I swear to God, I didn't know he was using her. I thought he was being helpful. I thought, we know." Patel's voice was gentle but firm. "We'll need a full statement, but right now, your daughter needs you. And she needs to know that none of this was her fault." Ivy's mother nodded, clutching her child tighter, and Reed stood slowly, his knees aching, his chest heavy with the weight of what could have happened if Flint hadn't alerted, if Ivy hadn't waved, if any single detail had gone differently. He looked down at Flint, who sat calmly now, watching the reunion with the quiet dignity of a dog who understood he'd done something important, even if he couldn't name it. Reed reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the worn tennis ball he always carried for moments like this. Moments when the work was done and the dog deserved more than commands and corrections. He held it up, and Flint's ears pricked forward, his tail starting a slow wag. "Good boy, Flint. You're such a good boy." He tossed the ball gently across the polished floor, and Flint bounded after it, the tension of the last hour dissolving into the simple joy of play. And for just a moment, the airport terminal felt a little less like a battlefield and a little more like a place where good still outweighed evil, where a dog's nose and a handler's instinct could stand between a child and a nightmare she never should have had to face. The evidence bags had been sealed, photographed, and logged into chain of custody by the time the airport's family crisis coordinator arrived with a soft-voiced woman named Dr. Marion Voss, a psychologist who specialized in child trauma and exploitation cases. Reed watched from 10 feet away as Dr. Voss knelt beside Ivy and her mother, speaking in tones too low for him to hear. But he could see the way Ivy's hands moved, small gestures toward the bench where her suitcase had sat, toward Flint who was resting near Reed's boots, toward the exit where Derek had been taken away in cuffs. She was trying to piece it together, trying to understand how the man who'd smiled at her and bought her a donut at the gas station that morning had turned her into a criminal without her ever knowing. Patel appeared at Reed's side, a tablet in her hand, her expression grim. Customs just ran Derek's records. 3 prior arrests for possession, 2 dismissed on technicalities, 1 plea deal that kept him out of prison. No priors involving minors. But that doesn't mean Ivy was the first. It just means she's the first time he got caught. Her jaw tightened. They're pulling his phone records now, looking for contacts, distribution networks, anyone else who might have been part of this. If he's been moving product through kids before, we'll find the pattern. Reed's stomach turned. Other Ivies somewhere in the system, used and discarded and maybe never found. It made him want to put his fist through the nearest wall. But he kept his voice level, controlled, because losing his composure now wouldn't help anyone. What about the mother? Is she clean? Preliminary interview says yes. No record, no financial red flags, no indication she knew what Derek was doing. She thought he was being helpful, packing Ivy's bag, booking the ticket, offering to drop her off so she didn't have to miss work. Patel's voice dripped with disgust. Classic grooming behavior. He made himself indispensable, then exploited the trust. She paused, glancing toward Ivy and her mother. The mother's cooperating fully. She's already given consent for a full search of their home, her vehicle, everything. She wants Derek buried. Reed nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to Ivy, who was wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket, while Dr. Voss handed her a small stuffed animal from a bag of comfort items the hospital kept on hand for situations like this. Situations that shouldn't exist but did anyway. How long until we can let them go? Another hour, maybe 2. We need the mother's full statement on record, and Dr. Voss wants to make sure Ivy's stable enough to leave without immediate psychiatric intervention. After that, Patel's voice softened. After that, they go home and try to rebuild a life that just got torn apart by someone they trusted. Reed's hand tightened on Flint's lead, and the dog looked up at him, sensing the tension, the barely controlled anger that Reed was struggling to keep beneath the surface. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on what had gone right instead of what could have gone wrong. Flint had alerted. Ivy had been honest. Derek was in custody. The drugs were off the street. No one had been hurt. Not physically, anyway. But the emotional damage, that would take years to unpack. Years of therapy and trust, rebuilt one fragile piece at a time. Grant approached from the evidence staging area, pulling off his gloves, his face lined with exhaustion. Final weight on the parcels came in at 3.2 kilograms. Street values estimated around 200,000 if it was cut and distributed in standard doses. DEA is already sending a team to interview Derek, and they're coordinating with the district attorney on federal charges. He glanced at Ivy, then back at Reed. That little girl was carrying enough poison to kill half the county, and she didn't even know it. She knows now. Reed's voice came out harsher than he intended, and Grant flinched slightly, but didn't argue. Because it was true, Ivy would carry this for the rest of her life. The knowledge that someone she trusted had turned her into a weapon, that her innocence had been the very thing that made her useful, and no amount of therapy or time or justice would ever completely erase that. Osakwe joined the group, her radio finally quiet, her posture still rigid from the adrenaline that hadn't fully drained yet. Tacticals finishing the debrief on the parking structure intercept. Derek's being transported to county holding, and they're keeping him in isolation until the federal charges are filed. No bail, no contact with anyone outside his lawyer. She looked at Reed, her expression unreadable. You're gonna get written up for that stunt, you know. Running a canine intercept without tactical backup, putting yourself and Flint in the path of a fleeing vehicle? It's going in the report. Reed met her eyes without flinching. I know. And you'd do it again. In a heartbeat. Osakwe's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. Yeah, I know. She reached down and scratched Flint behind the ears, and the dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Good boy, Flint. You're getting a steak tonight, courtesy of my wallet, because your handler's an idiot, but you're not. Flint's tail wagged harder, and despite everything, despite the weight of the day and the darkness they'd just pulled a child out of, Reed felt the corner of his mouth lift, just slightly, just enough to remind him that this job, for all its nightmares, still had moments where the good guys won and the bad guys went to prison, and a dog's loyalty made all the difference. Dr. Voss stood and approached the group, her voice low and professional. Ivy's stable for now, but she's going to need ongoing support. I've referred her mother to a trauma counselor who specializes in child exploitation cases, and I'll be checking in with them over the next few weeks. She looked directly at Reed. She asked if she could say goodbye to Flint before she leaves. Would that be all right? Reed's throat tightened, but he nodded. Of course. Dr. Voss gestured toward Ivy, who stood slowly from the bench, her mother's arm around her shoulders, and walked toward Reed with hesitant steps, her eyes red and swollen, but clear now, focused. She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting together, and looked down at Flint, who sat perfectly still, watching her with calm, patient eyes. Can I pet him? Ivy's voice was so small, so fragile, and Reed's heart cracked a little more. You can. Reed's voice was gentle, and he gave Flint the release command with a subtle hand gesture. The dog stood, stepped forward, and pressed his head into Ivy's outstretched hand, leaning into her touch the way he always did when someone needed comfort more than commands. Ivy's fingers sank into Flint's fur, and she knelt down, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. Flint stood perfectly still, letting her hold him, and Reed saw the way her mother's face crumpled, saw the way Patel turned away and wiped at her eyes, saw the way even Grant, who'd seen every kind of horror this job could offer, had to look at the floor for a moment. Thank you, Flint, Ivy whispered into the dog's fur. Thank you for saving me. Flint's tail wagged once, slow and deliberate, and Reed's vision blurred just slightly as he watched the little girl who'd waved at him with so much joy an hour ago, now clinging to the dog who'd found the evil hidden in her suitcase and stopped it before it could destroy her. And in that moment, Reed understood something he'd always known, but never quite felt with this much clarity. This was why he did this job, not for the arrests or the commendations or the statistics that looked good in reports, but for this, for the child who got to go home, for the mother who got her daughter back, for the dog who did what he was trained to do and made the world just a little bit safer in the process. Ivy pulled back, wiping her eyes, and looked up at Reed. Will I see you again? Reed crouched down, his voice steady and sure. If you ever need me, Ivy, if you ever need Flint, we'll be here. That's a promise. Ivy nodded, her chin trembling, and then her mother gently guided her toward the exit, toward the life that waited beyond this terminal, and Reed stood there with Flint at his side, watching them disappear into the crowd. The airport hummed around them, travelers moved past, announcements echoed from overhead speakers, and somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Reed looked down at Flint, whose dark eyes met his with the kind of understanding that didn't need words, and he reached into his pocket one more time, pulling out the tennis ball. One more time, buddy. You earned it. He threw the ball, and Flint chased it with pure, uncomplicated joy. And for just a moment, The world felt right again. The holding cell at the airport's security substation was a small, windowless room with cinder-block walls painted institutional beige and a single metal bench bolted to the floor. Derek sat on that bench now, his wrists still cuffed behind his back, his face slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature, and everything to do with the federal charges that were piling up faster than he could process them. Two uniformed officers stood outside the door, and through the small reinforced window, Derek could see the corridor bustling with activity. Agents in suits, officers in tactical gear, and somewhere beyond his line of sight, the little girl he'd turned into a mule without a second thought. Reed stood in the observation room next door, watching Derek through the one-way glass, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw tight enough to ache. Flint sat at his feet, still on lead, still alert, because the dog could sense the tension radiating off his handler like heat off asphalt in summer. Beside Reed, Special Agent Carla Brennan from the DEA's Regional Task Force reviewed notes on her tablet, her expression carved from stone. She'd arrived 20 minutes after Derek's arrest, called in the moment the weight and packaging of the narcotics confirmed this wasn't some small-time user with a bad decision. This was distribution-level product, cartel-grade purity, and the fact that it had been hidden in a child's luggage elevated it into a federal case with mandatory minimums that would put Derek away for decades. Brennan's voice was clipped, efficient, and cold. "We've identified the stamp on the packages. It matches a batch that's been moving through 3 states over the past 6 months, linked to a trafficking network out of the southern border. Derek's not the top of the chain. He's a courier, maybe mid-level at best, but he's our first solid lead into the distribution side." She glanced at Reed. "Your dog just handed us the biggest break we've had in 8 months. Reed didn't respond. He just kept staring at Derek through the glass, watching the man's leg bounce nervously, watching the way his eyes darted toward the door every few seconds, like he was still calculating escape routes, even though there weren't any left. Reed's hands curled into fists at his sides, and Flint shifted slightly, pressing his shoulder against Reed's leg, in a subtle gesture of grounding that the dog had learned over years of partnership. Brennan continued, her tone matter-of-fact in a way that made the horror of it worse. "We pulled his phone records, 15 calls in the past 2 weeks to a burner number registered in Nevada, all of them under 90 seconds. Classic coordination pattern. We're tracing the number now, but I'm betting it bounces through at least 3 proxy lines before we get anywhere close to the actual user." She swiped her screen, pulling up a new document. "His bank records show 3 cash deposits in the past month, each one just under the reporting threshold, total of $28,000. No legitimate income to explain it. No employment history beyond sporadic gig work. The money came from moving product, and based on the timeline, this wasn't his first run." Reed's stomach twisted. "How many times do you think he used Ivy?" Brennan's pause was answer enough, but she spoke anyway, her voice quieter now. "We don't know yet. Her mother says this was supposed to be Ivy's first solo trip to visit her aunt. But Derek had been in the picture for almost a year. If he was grooming her for this, he would have started small, tested boundaries, built trust, made himself indispensable." She looked at Reed, and for the first time, something almost human flickered in her expression. "We'll interview Ivy again when she's ready, with a child psychologist present and her mother's consent. If there were other trips, other packages, other times he used her, we'll find out. But right now the priority is making sure Derek doesn't walk on a technicality." Reed forced himself to breathe, to push down the rage that wanted to tear through his chest and turn into something ugly and unprofessional. "What do you need from me? Your statement, your dog certification records, and the body cam footage from the alert and the parking structure intercept. All of it needs to be airtight, because Derek's lawyer is going to argue entrapment, illegal search, improper canine handling, anything they can throw at the wall to see what sticks." Brennan's eyes hardened. "They'll try to paint Ivy as a willing participant. They'll suggest she knew what was in the suitcase. They'll do whatever it takes to reduce his exposure, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen." Reed's voice came out low and dangerous. "She's 8 years old." "I know." Brennan's jaw tightened. and that's exactly why we're going to bury him." The door to the observation room opened, and Patel stepped inside, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes sharp. Ivy's mother just finished her statement. She's confirmed that Derek had exclusive access to Ivy's luggage for the entire 24 hours before the flight. She also confirmed that he insisted on driving Ivy to the airport alone, said it would be easier, and that he wanted to help out. Patel's voice dripped with contempt. Classic isolation tactics. He separated the child from the parent, controlled the narrative, and made sure no one else had eyes on what he was doing. Brennan nodded, making notes. "That's good. That's leverage. If we can establish a pattern of coercive control and isolation, it strengthens the exploitation charges and makes it harder for his defense to argue ignorance or mistake." She looked back at Derek through the glass. "We're going in for the interview in 5 minutes. He's already been read his rights, and his public defender is on the way, but I want to get his initial reaction on record before he lawyers up completely." Reed's hand dropped to Flint's head, fingers sinking into the dog's fur, grounding himself in the solid warmth of the animal who'd started all of this with a single alert. "Can I be in the room?" Brennan hesitated, then shook her head. "You're a witness, and your presence could be used to argue intimidation or bias. But," she glanced at the one-way glass, "you can watch. And when we're done, if there's anything you want to add to the record, we'll make sure it's documented." Reed nodded stiffly, and Brennan and Patel left the observation room, their footsteps echoing down the corridor toward the holding cell. Reed stayed where he was, watching through the glass as the two women entered Derek's cell, as Brennan sat down across from him with her tablet and her recorder, as Patel positioned herself near the door with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. Brennan's voice was calm, clinical, and utterly devoid of emotion as she began the interview. "Mr. Derek Hastings, you've been informed of your rights. Do you understand them?" Derek's eyes flicked toward the recorder, toward Patel, toward the one-way glass where he couldn't see Reed, but probably sensed someone was watching. His voice came out hoarse, defensive. "I want a lawyer." "You'll have one. But while we wait, I want to make sure you understand the charges you're facing. Trafficking of a controlled substance, possession with intent to distribute, and exploitation of a minor in the commission of a felony. Federal charges, mandatory minimums, no plea deals until we've finished our investigation." Brennan leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to make every word land with weight. "You used an 8-year-old girl to move 3 kilograms of fentanyl through airport security. You packed her suitcase. You bought her ticket. You told her not to let anyone touch her luggage. And when she got caught, you tried to run." Derek's face flushed, anger and fear bleeding together. I didn't hurt her. She's fine. She didn't even know." "That's the point, Mr. Hastings." Brennan's voice turned to ice. "She didn't know. You made sure she didn't know. You manipulated a child into committing a federal crime without her understanding or consent. That's not a defense. That's an aggravating factor." Derek's mouth opened, closed, and his legs started bouncing again, faster now, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "I want my lawyer. I'm not saying anything else." Brennan stood slowly, her expression unreadable. "That's your right. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to trace every call you made, every deposit you received, every contact in your network. We're going to find out how many times you did this, how many other children you used, and who you were working for. And when we're done, you're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison where people know exactly what you did to that little girl." She turned and walked out, Patel following close behind, and the door slammed shut with a metallic finality that echoed through the observation room where Reed stood watching. Derek sat alone now, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders shaking, and Reed felt no pity, no sympathy, only the cold, hard satisfaction of knowing that Flint's nose and Ivy's honesty had just stopped a predator in his tracks. Brennan appeared beside Reed a moment later, her face still expressionless, but her voice carrying a thread of grim approval. "He'll break. They always do. And when he does, we'll take down everyone he worked with." Reed nodded, his throat tight, and looked down at Flint, who gazed up at him with calm, steady eyes that held no judgment, no anger, no fear. Only the quiet certainty that they'd done their job, and done it well. And somewhere beyond these walls, Ivy was going home. 3 days later, Reed found himself back at the same elementary school where he'd first met Ivy, standing in the same gymnasium with its polished floors and basketball hoops folded against cinderblock walls. But this time, there were no rows of cross-legged children waiting for a demonstration. This time, there was only one small figure sitting on the bleachers, her legs swinging above the floor, her purple jacket zipped up to her chin, even though the room was warm. Ivy's mother stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with the school counselor who'd helped arrange this visit, and Reed could see the exhaustion carved into her face, the sleepless nights, the guilt, the slow rebuilding of a life that had been shattered by someone she'd trusted. But when her eyes met Reed's, she managed a small, grateful nod, and he returned it with the kind of quiet respect reserved for people who'd survived something they never should have faced. Flint padded beside Reed across the gymnasium floor, his nails clicking softly on the wood, and Ivy looked up as they approached. Her face was thinner than it had been 3 days ago, pale and drawn with shadows under her eyes that made her look older than 8. But when she saw Flint, something shifted. Her shoulders relaxed, her hands unclenched, and the smallest hint of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Reed stopped a few feet away, keeping his posture open, non-threatening, letting Ivy control the space between them. "Hey, Ivy, your mom said you wanted to see Flint again." Ivy nodded, her voice soft but steady. "I wanted to say thank you, the right way. I didn't get to before. I was too scared." She looked down at Flint, who sat calmly at Reed's side, his tail sweeping once against the floor. "Is it okay if I give him something?" Reed's throat tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "Of course." Ivy reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, slightly crumpled piece of paper, folded into a careful square. She unfolded it slowly, revealing a crayon drawing, a picture of a black and tan dog with a red collar, sitting beside a little girl with brown hair and a purple jacket. Above them, in wobbly letters, she'd written, "Thank you, Flint. You are a hero." Reed's chest ached, and he crouched down so he was at Ivy's level, his hand resting on Flint's shoulder. "That's beautiful, Ivy. Can I keep it for him?" She nodded, her eyes shining, and held the drawing out carefully. Reed took it with both hands, treating it with the same reverence he'd give evidence in a federal case, and folded it back into its square before tucking it into his vest pocket, right over his heart. "Flint's going to be very proud of this," Reed said quietly. "You know what he's most proud of, though?" Ivy shook her head, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "He's proud that you were brave, that you told the truth even when you were scared, that you trusted us to help you." Reed's voice was steady, firm, the kind of voice that carried weight without pressure. "What happened to you wasn't your fault, Ivy. Not even a little bit. Derek lied to you. He used you, and that's on him, not you. You didn't do anything wrong." Ivy's chin trembled, and she looked down at her hands. "But I carried it. I carried the bad stuff, and I didn't even know." Her voice cracked. "What if someone got hurt because of me?" Reed's hand moved without thinking, reaching out to rest gently on her shoulder, and he waited until she looked up at him before he spoke again. "No one got hurt. You know why? Because Flint found it before it could go anywhere. Because you were honest when we asked you questions. Because you helped us stop Derek before he could hurt anyone else." He paused, letting the words settle. "You didn't carry that poison, Ivy. Derek did. You were just caught in the middle, and now you're free." Tears spilled down Ivy's cheeks, but she didn't look away. She just nodded, her breath hitching, and then she slid off the bleacher and dropped to her knees in front of Flint, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck and burying her face in his fur. Flint stood perfectly still, his tail wagging slowly, and Reed saw the way the tension drained out of Ivy's small body, the way she clung to the dog like he was the only solid thing left in a world that had tilted sideways. Reed stayed crouched beside them, one hand on Flint's back, the other resting lightly on Ivy's shoulder, and he let her cry until the tears ran out and her breathing steadied, and she finally pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve. "Flint's always going to be out there, keeping people safe," Reed said softly. "And if you ever need him, if you ever need me, you know where to find us." Ivy nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "At the airport." "At the airport," Reed confirmed, and something in his chest loosened just slightly. "But hopefully next time, it'll just be to say hello. No suitcases, no bad guys, just a visit." Ivy's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Can I come see him again? Sometime, when I'm not so sad?" Reed's vision blurred, just for a second, and he had to swallow hard before he could answer. "Anytime you want, Ivy. Anytime." Ivy reached into her pocket again and pulled out a small dog treat, the kind sold in the checkout line at pet stores, wrapped in crinkly plastic. "My mom said I could give him this, if it's okay." Reed glanced at the treat, then at Flint, whose ears had perked forward with interest, and he nodded. "It's okay. He's off duty right now. He's earned it." Ivy unwrapped the treat carefully and held it out in her palm, her hand trembling just slightly. And Flint took it with the kind of gentle precision that came from years of training and an instinct to never take more than what was offered. He crunched it twice, swallowed, and then licked Ivy's hand, his tail wagging harder now, and Ivy laughed, a real laugh, bright and unexpected, and it echoed through the empty gymnasium like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Reed stood slowly, his knees protesting, and Ivy's mother approached from the entrance, her eyes red, but her expression soft. "Thank you, Officer Reed, for everything, for catching him, for protecting her, for this." She gestured toward Ivy, who was scratching behind Flint's ears now, her face lighter than it had been in days. "She hasn't smiled like that since before." "I know." Reed's voice was rough, and he cleared his throat. "She's a strong kid. She's going to be okay." Ivy's mother nodded, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder, and together they walked toward the exit, Ivy turning back once to wave at Flint with both hands, her smile still fragile but real. Reed waved back and Flint's tail thumped against the floor, and then they were gone, the gymnasium door swinging shut with a soft click that left Reed and his partner alone in the quiet space. Reed pulled the folded drawing from his pocket and looked at it again. The careful crayon lines, the wobbly letters, the simple truth of a child's gratitude captured in wax and paper. He thought about Derek sitting in a federal holding cell, awaiting trial for charges that would lock him away for decades. He thought about the 3 kilograms of fentanyl that would never reach the streets, the lives that would never be destroyed by poison hidden in a pig suitcase. He thought about Ivy's face when she hugged Flint, the way she'd laughed for the first time since her world had been turned upside down by someone who was supposed to care for her. And he thought about the promise he'd made to her, that Flint would always be out there, keeping people safe, and that if she ever needed them, they'd be there. Reed folded the drawing back into its square and tucked it carefully into his wallet, right behind his badge, where it would stay as a reminder of why he did this work, why he trusted his partner's nose more than any technology or procedure, and why some victories were measured not in arrests or commendations, but in the smile of a little girl who had been saved from becoming a casualty in someone else's war. He looked down at Flint, whose dark eyes met his with the calm certainty of a dog who knew his job and loved it. And Reed's hand dropped to the animal's head, fingers sinking into warm fur. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." Flint stood, stretched, and fell into step beside Reed as they walked across the gymnasium floor, through the double doors, and out into the crisp afternoon air, where the sun was shining and the world kept turning, and somewhere in the distance another shift was waiting, another threat to find, another life to protect, another reason to trust the bond between handler and dog that had just proven once again to be the difference between tragedy and hope. And as Reed loaded Flint into the K9 unit and climbed into the driver's seat, he felt the weight of the past 3 days begin to lift, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that this time they'd won. This time, the innocent had been protected. This time, a child got to go home. And that, more than anything else, was worth every risk, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt that came with wearing the badge and trusting a dog to see the dangers that humans tried to hide. Reed started the engine, glanced in the rearview mirror at Flint settling into his spot in the back, and pulled out of the school parking lot, heading toward whatever came next.